Hi, I hope this finds everybody well. This is my first YouTube live video. I don't know if I'll get anybody watching, and that's okay. What I wanted to discuss was my delve into Stoicism. When I was younger, my brother called me the philosopher. I've always thought I've had a very busy mind. Um, it's not that I'm intelligent. That's not at all what I mean to say. It's just that I've always thought deeper and taken time to reflect. So what happened is that my father had some issues, some health issues going in and going out, and he had then some issues of the mind. Some things were happening there that were out of place, and it took a while. It was described as PTSD from his time in Vietnam. Um, but what it turned out to be later, after certain behaviors had occurred and things like that, it actually ended up to be frontal temporal dementia, which is it's not as common as Alzheimer's, and it can start as young as 40. So some of his behaviors were very much explained, and so that diagnosis was um, very relieving to our family because it explained that a lot of his behavior wasn't his fault, and that was a very important diagnosis. Um, but what my father was very active in his opinions, and I remember him saying one time, and now this is an opinion. This I don't know all the facts. I did look a little bit into it. Um, but he had an opinion about Henry Kissinger, and it wasn't a great opinion. Being in the Vietnam War, he didn't agree with Kissinger's negotiations. And so I don't get down a rabbit hole of misinformation. That was my dad's stance. He didn't like Henry Kissinger because he felt like he negotiated improperly for Americans and those who had given their lives and things like that. So I always remember that, and I had always remembered him talking about that and very strongly and more opinionated than what I just said. But there was a dedication to Admiral Stockdale, and Admiral Stockdale, as everyone knows who knows Admiral Stockdale, was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, in the Hanoi Hilton, and um, Henry Kissinger was in attendance to that dedication. And of course, me being not intelligent but a thinker, I was like, why would he attend um, a dedication to a man that he potentially, with his negotiations, kept in the Hanoi Hilton longer? That was my big question. So I started to look into James Stockdale. I got very interested in him. I looked into him. He had free writings on his Wikipedia. I clicked on those, his warrior triad, things like that. And in those, very, very quickly, he goes right to Epictetus. So when he went to Epictetus, I started to then be like, all right, well, who is this Epictetus guy? I had never heard of him. I started to look at some of the quotes and where those quotes came, and I started to look at why Stockdale was so fond of Epictetus. Come to find out that Stockdale kept Epictetus's book in his footlocker, and I thought that as I'm dealing with kind of losing my father to dementia, and I had to start to answer some questions with myself. I had to start to understand some uncontrollables. I had to start to understand how I move forward because you start to question, like, is this going to happen to me? Is this genetic? Is this? How am I going to be for my kids? How am I going to feel this? I mean, a lot, a lot. How am I going to transition without my father? I hadn't really had my father for a period of time anyway because of his lack of cognitive ability. Um, so I started to look at answering some of the own questions that I had in my own personal life. And um, I think at sometimes I was enabled and I used excuses to not do things or to not get through things as quickly as I could. Now, I immediately went out and I got this book. Um, this was the book that Stockdale kept in his footlocker. And um, the quote that I saw very quickly that read to exactly what I had to stop making excuses for who I was. I had to stop um, justifying behavior because of maybe my super ego or my childhood or whatever it was. So Epictetus says here, disease is an impediment to the body, but not to the will, unless the will itself chooses. Lameness is an impediment to the leg, but not to the will. And add this reflection on the occasion of everything that happens, for you will find it an impediment to something else, but not to yourself. So Epictetus, who was a slave, who was hobbled by his master, um, says basically like you can have an issue um, with your arm or your hand or any impediment. You can see that you have an impediment in relationships or anything. And if you realize that it's not an impediment to the human will, to you driving forward and moving forward in the best direction, um, then it really is leaving it to your own self control. It's leaving you to make the decisions. No external force has to decide what you do or don't do. And yes, you're going to have difficult times. You're going to have physical pain. You're going to have mental pain. But what you do is that you realize that you're a lot like what I always tell my athletes: the water that moves down the river, there's gonna be sometimes debris and dirty and cold and toxic water that comes under that bridge, but that water moves down and it goes away. And as the water that comes down to replenish, we're hoping that it's clean. We're hoping that the water that is flowing down after that will clean and cleanse and get all that out of there. And so when I look at Epictetus, I look further. But that one quote about, an impediment to the body is not an impediment to the will, unless really you choose it to be, has driven me forward. And I think that when you look at Stoicism, many people find it dehumanizing, but it really isn't. There are quotes that I might share that talk about death, that talk about death of others. And what I read in that, and again, not being an academic, not having, really studied philosophy except for my own personal studies, is that it is more about gratitude. It's more about, understanding that death is one of the few facts that we have in life. We have birth and we have death, and those are two simple truths that we have. And that when we talk about stoicism, we talk about hopefully cutting to the quick in the reality of the situation and having gratitude when we talk about death. The big thing that the Daily Stoic has really promoted is memento mori, and that is basically what the people of Bhutan have looked at. Not that specifically, but they actually meditate on death. And the reason why they do that is to live more in the present. So when we look at Stoicism, people say, "Oh, he had a very Stoic approach to it." That's not always the case. So Stoicism gets thrown around, and in the past couple years, Stoicism has kind of had a revival or an awakening or a boom because people like the quotes, and they're in their lockdown phases, or they're in these really uncontrollable situations and they have to make the most of it and find the best in this, but they don't really go all the way through it. And I that is not like me being pious. If you listen to certain people who teach philosophy and have studied philosophy in depth, they can name everybody. They know the timelines. They know what they did, who they were from. They can name the area of Greece, or maybe it's the Iberian Peninsula, which is present day Spain and Portugal and Gibraltar. So they're going to talk about very specific academic things. And so by no means do I say that you don't look at it right, but I would say too that when you look at Epictetus, you have to understand he didn't write anything down. That this was all um, transcribed by one of his students, and the same thing with Socrates. Socrates is quoted um, wonderfully, but whether he really did or didn't say is always going to be a question. But you still need to look at Socrates. Socrates is an important person in the discussion, and you go all the way back, and you got to kind of look at Socrates, and you have to look at other philosophers. And so when I look at philosophy, um, I look at connections, and so I found connections in Epictetus. I found connections, obviously, starting with Socrates, Seneca, um, actually Lao Tzu, who was Eastern, um, Moreshi Yoshiba, who is a much more modern Japanese philosopher and founder of Aikido. So, what it is trying to find the connections and realizing that uh, massive stretches of geography separated and time and in borderline different epochs, and they really kind of these ideas of virtue transcend time and space. And I don't mean time and space to get all quantum, but meaning literally geographically. They never cross paths. The Eastern ideas and the Western ideas, they never ever communicated, yet they really resonate similarly on the level of virtue. So that was my delve into Stoicism. It came from um, just a transition time in my life, trying to figure out um, how I was going to navigate and how I was going to process a good man being dealt a heavy blow, and then understanding the politics of the world and trying to take the right stance on that, and then also figuring out how I could put my past behind me. And I think that when you look at stoicism and you look at philosophy in general, that I want everyone to remember that words are words, but if those words can maybe turn the bulb on in your head and get you to act better, I think that that is like unbelievable, and that is the best thing that could happen. And it's not like the 4-minute motivational speech that gets you the momentary inspiration. It's that enduring kind of mantra that carries you through, that helps you, the performance cue, whatever it may be, that helps you to push through difficult times. And those difficult times too are when things don't seem clear, when the things that are going on in your life don't seem clear, they don't make sense, they seem to be unnatural. um, I would argue that stoicism is the best way. And Seneca, if you're having trouble at work and you're struggling with that, I think Seneca is a great person to look into, because he dealt with those things. He was a very complex figure, and you have to look at his complexities to understand him more. So please feel free to reach out. Um, add anything. I do not want to go down a road too complex, because I want you to kind of look at what you want to look at. I want you to understand what you want to understand. I want things to mean things to you, much like the Socratic method. Ask a question and then see how people respond. Can you ask a question and actually listen to people's response? Can you actually have discourse? Can you have dialogue? Can you accept rhetoric? Can you be a master of rhetoric on your own to make sure you deliver a message in the best possible way? And that might be something that we talk about down the road, something that I looked at. How do you master rhetoric? And it's it's not easy, especially this day and age. So please feel free to reach out, and I hope I didn't stutter and stammer too much on my first live video.